I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, so this is who we are. So everybody on the team of AFA in the room. We got Ray, who works membership there in the back. We've got Carl, who is our vice president. We've got Brian here working the cameras. All right, and Tamara, who is our VP of Cyber Patriot. And Josh, you're like an advisor or something, I'm not sure what role. And we say that very loose because we are in the process of reorganizing how we do this state, hopefully as a model for the way the rest of the country is going to end up doing it, but we're doing away with chapters. So we're kind of in the middle of this Etch-a-Sketch, for those of you old enough to know what that is, where we're kind of redesigning how we're going to do business going forward. But that's who we are. A lot of folks, first-time visitors, that's what we're doing here. But thank you for joining us, everybody who haven't before. We do have a pretty good list of sponsors and partners in this business of what we're doing, and they really do help fill in the gaps, make things happen, and enable us. We're not a deep-pocketed organization the way that we set things up, so we ask people to pre-register, and help pay for the events to help offset costs and everything else to make it all happen. But we have wonderful sponsors, none of which, well, Brian, you wear multiple hats. He's one of those up there. He is the Arrow Retirement Options over there on the far left side. So thank you on multiple hats from that one. But, education, advocacy, support, these are the verbs. This is what we do. It's why we exist. The Air Force Association was founded by the very same people who started the United States Air Force. Actually, we existed prior to the Air Force by almost a year and a half. It was early in 1946, and it was September of 1947 when the Air Force was founded. So they knew it was in work and everything else. In fact, the first Air Force magazine was published before we had an Air Force. But that's just kind of what it is. This is to be the voice, the force behind the force. The ones that can, the people in uniform are restricted in what they can say, but advocacy organizations, we can talk to elected officials. We can lobby, if you will. And by the way, the think tank for the whole air and space forces is the Doolittle Center, which is part of the AFA. So when you see Dave Deptula, he's kind of the face of a lot of that, who is on every news network you ever want to meet, things going on around the world. That is the voice of the AFA. That's the type of stuff that we do. Hey, we have a YouTube channel now, all right, so that's what these cameras are for. We record stuff, so all of our meetings, our virtual meetings, the ones we do in person, all of these are going to be recorded so that people, I wasn't able to make it. We're going to have this video library available for people to go back and watch and see what happened, especially for some of the virtual events that we have, because we're going to have some amazing speakers with that. But looking ahead where we are, we already did our Doolittle Raiders toast last week. Thank you for the feedback. He said we were better than National AFA.
Oh,
no,
better.
More entertaining. That was the right term. I don't know if it was better, but more entertaining.
We'll take it.
But today we're going to be talking about caring for our veterans. Now jumping into May, and I was telling Carl, it's amazing because my brain has been working on the May events. I keep forgetting we're still in April. So it looked like the slide was wrong to my brain when I was looking at it, the title slide. But we're going to have is going to be talking about the F-117. He talked here at the last meeting. He's going to be talking up at our Sterling Heights. Squadron commander of the F-117, the Nighthawk, the Stink Bug, the Black Jet, of all the many names that plane had. So a little bit of cool history on that. Then we had, this is the one that we added recently for our virtual event for May, is going to be Boeing, the company, talking about the plane they build and the program and how that works. Because this is the plane that's coming to Selfridge in the future that they announced a couple weeks ago. So hopefully a lot of interest in what's going to be in our neighborhood and part of the Michigan Air National Guard here in the near future. Then we have the 110th Wing that's going to be coming down here. They had talked before up in Sterling Heights, but the 110th Wing, who does the Predator Reaper, the drone, they don't call it that, RPA operations, command and control, and cyber. So that's what they do, and they're going to bring the whole leadership team down the road here for the next presentation that we're doing here in May. End of May, we have a parade. Those who want to come to the parade, that's the actual truck we're going to borrow again. I finally made that arrangement. We have a driver, thanks to Josh's team there. He's got somebody on the cadre that's a driver. We'll put posters on the side. And for those of you who don't know, this is my tradition, those are dog bones. I don't hand out candy to kids, they get enough, but the dogs and everything in the crowd get dog bones from me. But we'll do it all this time if we get enough people wanting to participate in the parade. And then of course, the Grand Marshal of the parade this time is an Air Force Second Lieutenant, AKA Miss America. All right, so hopefully we can get some cadets and all there to meet her and everything else. Yep, coming to meet America. Looking even more forward, in June, really cool, we're gonna meet out at Starbase. STEM education for the elementary school age, it's the whole idea is to get them interested in STEM. Started by Barb from up in Lapeer. I'll think of her last name here in a second. Barb's a former NASA astronaut who started this program. There are more than 50 of these around the country now. It's out at Selfridge. We're gonna have a catered lunch from Mission Barbecue out there, but you're gonna get to see the space shuttle, the simulator, robotics, 3D printing, everything that they do out there, getting kids interested in STEM. And it apparently works. My daughter went through the basic, the advanced, and a women's academy there, and she is now going off to a STEM degree in college, so that part of it works. Then we have our annual picnic in August. We're going to be out at the Enlisted Heritage House on the lakefront. That's always our best attended event that we do. Well over 100 people there every time we do it. And bumped till September because it's going to be out at the Air Museum at Selfridge. Our event we've branded Airplanes, Tanks, and Tacos. So we set up a taco bar, we drive out the M4 Sherman tank and let people crawl around on airplanes and learn about history. So once again, a very popular event that we do every year. All right, so I always do every meeting, aerospace education update. Josh wonders what I get. I Google it. All right, so what happened in terms of aerospace and defense on April 26th? So let's find out. Okay, chronologically, we're going to go through this. I had to arrange all these little events. But one of the major first employments of an Air Force was actually by the Luftwaffe back in the Spanish Civil War. And it was on April 26th that they launched a massive air raid on a little town of only 5,000 people in Spain. They pummeled the town and killed about a quarter of the occupants and completely wiped it out. But it was the first major employment of air power by an Air Force. I mean, it had been used in World War I and everything else, but this took it to a new stage. It was also indiscriminate bombing of a civilian city. This is the thermometer then that the rest of the world took, as in this is the standard at the time. So when we started bombing cities and everything else, it was the precedent that was set here, which then led to some other things later on in Geneva Conventions about targeting civilians, et cetera, et cetera. But this is where it started. Okay, Korea, we had one of our pilots become an ace on the 26th of April. I'd actually not heard that name. What he's the 5th one just in Korea at the time. Korean War history, we could talk that all day long. Fascinating, world-changing event. Most people go, Korean War, what's that about? Trust me, everything about that war drove where we are and what we're doing today. And if you ever want to get into that, we can. What's that plane look like? It looks like the SR-71. Did you know that it was never designed as the SR-71 to begin with? It was designed as an interceptor. It was supposed to go out and be able to go after Soviet bombers at high speed and everything. It actually developed from that into what we now know as the SR-71. You can see there a little bit different profile. They made it a little bit bigger, a little more gas, that type of stuff. Here's the other one. If you look at nomenclature of airplanes in the U.S. Air Force, we have nothing that starts with SR. It's not strategic reconnaissance. It's actually RS would be the proper configuration. Reconnaissance, strategic, and then the number. But when the president made this once classified program public, he got dyslexic and said it the wrong way. So instead of changing instead of keeping it and correcting the president, they just said, well, I guess that's it. Whoop, they changed it. So instead of the RS-71, it became the SR-71. There you go. There's your history of the day. But it started with this fighter version. The radar designed for this and the missiles designed for this were then put into the F-111 program, which was actually an Air Force, a Navy interceptor to begin with. It became an Air Force attack airplane. That program was also a failure, but the radar designed for this, the missiles designed for this, went into that program, which eventually jumped into the F-14. So the AUG-9 radar that was designed for this ultimately ended up as the radar of the F-14. The missiles designed for this ultimately became as what we know as the Phoenix long-range air-to-air missiles that were used with the F-14 also. It's amazing the history of some of this stuff. We blew up one hell of a big bomb on this day in the 1960s. Now, I don't know about you, but it's weird to me. I think of nuclear weapons, we blew them up in the 40s. We were still exploding these things well into the 60s at one point. Operation Crossfire, 48 nuclear tests blowing up in the Nevada desert. Not one or two. This was going on in the course of 2 years. 48 times things went boom in Nevada. So if you ever go up, I'm trying to remember the name of those flats up there. They're right in the middle of all the airspace and all the restricted areas, so you can't get anywhere near them. But this is when we did the crazy stuff like put it near ships, put it near people, what is it doing, those types of things. And if you go look today, this is the big picture of that area, and this is where that particular bomb went off. This is Google Earth today. You can still see that. Right there. So the last time, you ever watched the movie The Green Berets? There was a thing there when they went and they captured that Vietnamese general or whatever, and they have him drugged and they go out in the jungle, they put the balloon up in the air and the airplane comes along and swoops up the balloon and off he goes, and it takes him away. That system really existed. We used it for a long time. It was originally to help pick up NASA parts and everything from space with airplanes. They finally figured out that it could be one hell of a roller coaster ride for people. So it was like an emergency extraction type of a thing, but it was the last time it was used because they killed somebody with it. All right, so they decided that maybe there was a better way to do things. But literally, C-130 with that would go catch those balloons, gather it up, and then reel it in off the ground. That must have been one heck of a ride, I would think. All right, Carl. MiG-23s, our favorite airplane, crashed at Ypsilanti, was it last year? Typical distortion.
This year.
Last year.
Within the last 12 months, but last calendar year, so you're both correct. But it was the last time we actually flew these. Now, if before you heard me do our talk about Constant Peg, that program, and it was actually from somebody's call sign and the name of his wife. Constant was his call sign, Peg was his wife, so Constant Peg was actually a classified program where we flew Soviet-built airplanes for decades in the middle of the desert, mainly MiG-21s and 23s. Very unreliable, unsafe airplane. This general decided to go on one last flight. It was like his Finney flight in the Air Force. It went out of control, it crashed, he died. We quit flying the MiG-23s as a result of that, but this was also on the 26th of April. 1986, 26th of April. Anybody want to guess what happened? Not really military, but a place called Chernobyl went boom. It's the anniversary of what happened in Chernobyl. Now that's in today what's near Kiev in Ukraine, not in Russia as we know it, but it was the Soviet Union. And then the last one that I have is, it was the first flight of this little cool looking airplane, a little sports car thing designed by now our NATO partner Sweden, which by the way, Michigan is in discussions with of making them another partner state through the state partnership program for us. That would give us Latvia, Liberia, and Sweden. If we do that, I think it's the first state where we have 3 partner countries. But this little jet, which is actually sold pretty well overseas, and Ukraine is talking about trying to get their hands on some of them. There's the original Gripen, the 39, and then there's a new version of it coming out. But Sweden has a long history of producing their own jet aircraft, and they've had some pretty spectacular models through the years. All right, so that being said, I'm going to shut up now. We're going to get a chance to hear from our real guest speaker. But Mark, it's great to have you here. One of the favorite subjects is taking care of our veterans. I was blessed when I was in DC working in safety to be able to get involved with a lot of programs which included resiliency, taking care of our veterans, suicide prevention, sexual assault prevention, and everything. So at one point I literally Googled suicide prevention expert in Michigan, and I ended up talking to, what was her name? Cheryl, who made the introduction, and this is how we met. Once again, creative Googling can get you all sorts of things. It ultimately led to me talking on the phone and then getting to meet you today. But Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you run through it. But thank you for being here, and love the topic of taking care of those who care for us.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks for the introduction and everyone being here. I love the SR71 story, and I think that's a good model. So if I misspeak or don't describe things clearly, just adopt my version, and we'll all be fine.
Right.
So yeah, I'm Mark. I'm a psychologist and researcher at the Ann Arbor VA. I'm also at the University of Michigan in the Department of Psychiatry as a professor there. And in terms of my interests and kind of how I came to do this work, since I started grad school, I've been working on how to support people who struggle with drugs and alcohol. And one of the topics we were looking at early on was how do the messages that we as loved ones or treatment providers give people who struggle with substances make them feel and do long term. And one of the things we noticed is a lot of treatment programs, especially when starting this work in the early 2000s, would interact with people who were struggling with their substance use and remind them of all the damage done by their use of substances. And we felt like this was just kind of piling on and making them feel worse, and we wondered, what did that mean on the extreme end in terms of pushing people to be more likely to engage in suicidal behaviors? So for me, my kind of core interest is drug and alcohol treatment, but this interest in suicide prevention grew out of it, and then it's kind of grown on its own since that time. We also do some work on chronic pain, but I don't think that's going to be a focus today. So this is just your standard disclaimer slide. There are a lot of different people who funded this research. I don't speak for them. I also have 2 employers. I don't speak for them either. And in terms of conflict of interest, I'm connected to a startup here in Ann Arbor that is involved in topics related to drug and alcohol use. But again, I don't think it's relevant, but I want to just be transparent. Okay, so for today, I was thinking we could kind of go through 4 phases of the talk. The first one is just some general facts about suicide. How suicide impact military service members, and in particular focusing on veterans. Then I'll talk about just some theories of suicide risk. What are ways we conceptualize who's at risk and what puts people at greater risk. I'll talk about a couple of interventions. That's really where my heart is these days, beyond just describing what we're seeing, how can we change outcomes, and then I'll talk a bit about future directions. And it's a small group, so I think it'll get dull if it's just me talking at you this whole time. What I'll probably do is just go through each phase and then take a step back and do questions, and then we can keep going. But to be transparent, my passion is more in that middle ground about the treatment. So, okay. So just the basic factual information, to know what you're going to do and come up with a plan, you need to survey the environment. And when I moved to Ann Arbor from California in 2008, and when I came here, that was right around when people were returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. The media was picking up on the fact that maybe there was something to be concerned about in terms of mental health and suicide. There were reports, a few congressional inquiries. And the VA wanted to know, was under pressure. What are you guys doing? What's suicide like in your patients and in veterans in general? And the VA didn't really have an answer. And that wasn't necessarily the VA's fault. No one really had data. There wasn't surveillance on how many people are dying by suicide. That was true inside the military and in the VA. And so there was this effort to just get going on the descriptive side. And some of the things we take for granted now were unknown at that time. And I was lucky to be a part of that. Ann Arbor, kind of in terms of VA data infrastructure, was on the receiving end of the mortality data, cleaning it, doing the analyses, and the information coming out of that is, I think, still relevant, and that's going to be my next few slides. If you're ever interested or people are asking you about suicide, you can Google it. This is the 2023 report. I'm no longer involved in this, but they're still doing their thing. You can easily get to it. It's a great resource, and it breaks down rates by branch of the military, year, gender, sex, all those sorts of things. And so that's what I'll talk about next. I have just a disclaimer here that throughout this talk, I have a personal belief that we're better at protecting people if we understand the facts of what's going on, but it's important just to take a step back and realize each of these data points reflects a person, and I don't want to in any way seem cold or disinterested in the trauma caused by suicide for individual families and their communities. Okay, so I've got 4 slides of data fact things here. It's a little small, I don't know if you can read them, but the first one is showing the number of suicide, just counts of suicide. And what you see is you often hear there's an epidemic of suicide in the US, that it's increasing, and that is all true. Those increases are driven primarily by non-veterans. You can see the veteran line is a dark blue line. That stayed pretty stable, and the non-veteran suicide rate has been on the greatest increase. This is pretty zoomed out, so it's around 6,000. If you zoom in here around that number, you can see this is the trend in veterans over the same time period, the same 20-year time period. And what you see is it was pretty flat, and then as you got into people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, it started to spike, and then it stayed up at about that level. It bounces around a bit each year, but it's been elevated ever since 2008. So those are counts or numbers of suicides. Another way of looking at it is look at rates. The population of veterans also fluctuates year to year, so sometimes it's hard to compare apples to apples. To do that, we often create rates per 100,000 of suicide. And when you look at the numbers that way, the 2 lines that we looked at before flip. So there you see non-veterans are relatively flat at around, now they're about 17 per 100,000 people who die by suicide who are non-veterans. Veterans are slightly elevated to start, and then that distance has spread over time. So they're now up to closer to 30 per 100,000. So that's a noticeable difference. If you break it out by gender, you can see men are at greater risk of dying by suicide than women, and both lines are going up. The total numbers of deaths are greater for men, but in women, the degree of increase is markedly greater. So this dark blue line in men is around 45% increase over time. This is 60% increase in women. So there's a lot that we need to do to understand suicide risk in our female veterans. All right, so 2 more fact slides here to get through. And this is just by branch of the military. And this slide, there's a couple things I want to highlight here. First of all, this is looking at the year since separation. And instead of just looking at overall rates of suicide, this breaks it down by within 12 months of separating. And if you benchmark this, let's say to 2020 to where we were on the other slide, the rates of suicide are notably higher than the overall average rate. So it shows you that a time post-separation is a high-risk time period. The rates go up from around 30. If we use that, that's where you'd be for on average for a veteran. You can see that all these lines are elevated, and they are different by branch of the military, with Marines at the highest risk. And that's changed a little bit over time, but that's pretty consistent. The other thing here to highlight is the dotted lines are years we don't have enough data. So it's hard to study this topic because of low numbers. It's good on a human level, makes it.
Can I ask a question? Can you repeat?
Yeah.
This one is about first 12 months of separation? Okay.
Post-separation.
Okay. Right.
The other one was on average being a veteran,
Got it.
just in your life. And then the last slide here is looking at means of suicide. And when you're talking about suicide in the VA and in veterans, you're almost always talking about firearm-related suicide. So firearms account for about 75% of all suicides in veterans. And when you look at how has suicide changed over time, the overall trend in veteran suicide is primarily being driven by veteran firearm-related suicides. So that is a big part of the story, but figuring out how to talk about that in a way that's fair and engaging, doesn't turn people off, is something that the VA is still struggling with, and it's I think it'd be a good topic to discuss here if we want. Okay, so a couple more things on risk. So if you want to say, okay, we just talked about demographics, who's at risk. What are some other more psychological constructs? The way that I learned about suicide risk when I was in training 20-some odd years ago now, was focused around a diagnosis or a symptom. So you would hear that a patient had depression. Depression puts people at risk for suicide. We should be careful with that patient. But it wasn't really precise, and there wasn't data behind that. So again, when I mentioned that in Ann Arbor we had data on mortality, we did a series of studies over the course of 3 or 4 years linking VA treatment records to the mortality data to look at what predicts who is at greatest risk for suicide. And in doing that, we were able to look at different psychiatric conditions and compare them and see, what do these risk factors look like in the real world in the VA. And at the time, again, I look back now, it seems kind of rudimentary, but really with the exception of Sweden and Norway, where they had health records on every citizen in their country, no one knew what made patients at greater risk for suicide. And not too surprisingly, in some of these papers, the consistent finding was a psychiatric condition increased your risk, that depression and bipolar disorder were particularly problematic. Substance use in women was actually the greatest risk factor. And PTSD, somewhat surprisingly, was almost always consistently the lowest risk diagnosis. I don't know, it may be that the VA has a lot of resources to help people with PTSD, or maybe there's more of a culture being able to disclose you have PTSD, and so people can talk about it more, but they're the consistently lowest risk. Okay, so we did, several papers on that topic, but on a personal level, I think I started to get a little less engaged in that work, because I felt, yes, we know, let's say, someone with a substance use disorder is at greater risk for suicide, but it really just doesn't tell us, that means that the rate per 100,000 gets up to, I think for substance use disorders, it's 120 per 100,000. That leaves thousands and thousands of people who would be falsely identified if you focus on everyone with a substance use disorder. And most risk factors are at lower rates than that. So you get this issue of, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to go treat everyone with this condition like they're suicidal? That's not ideal, and that's not very clinically thoughtful. But you don't want to miss anyone either. So the bottom line is our research leaves a lot to be desired in understanding who would be at risk, why they become at risk, and when. So most of the studies I was showing you look at risk over a year or multiple years. That doesn't necessarily tell you today or tomorrow who's going to be at risk. And so why don't we know more about suicide? I think you guys probably recognize this location. This is Michigan Stadium, I guess, for those who don't, if there's anyone. But I couldn't resist the little UofM propaganda, but as you may know, UofM Stadium seats approximately 100,000 people. I don't know if you've ever been there on a game day and tried to meet up with a friend. Even if someone said, maybe you would avoid Michigan Stadium on a game day.
No, I actively
am there.
I'm actively there.
Yeah.
I'm in there.
You're
Right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you've ever tried to meet anyone there, you know it is hard to locate someone. And we're talking about risk per 100,000 per year. And the rates on average in the US are 16. Our high risk groups get up to 120, 130 per 100,000. Even finding 100 people there is a daunting task. And so I think it's a good reminder that this work is hard, and there are some built-in challenges in doing it that sometimes lead us to draw the wrong conclusions or maybe do the wrong things when we're trying to help people. Okay, a couple more pieces on risk, and then I want to check in. So I mentioned that the old model was diagnosis, risk. There was a movement that started about 30 years ago to try to understand suicide not as a symptom of a psychiatric condition, but as an outcome in its own right. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One, many different psychiatric conditions can lead to suicide. Two, there are actually a lot of people who might not even have a psychiatric condition who die by suicide. And understanding that outcome is more important than coming up with a perfect model for the syndrome. So there are a couple different models. This is the best known. You might hear about this if you're talking to people about suicide theories. Thomas Joyner has a book called Why People Die by Suicide. He lost his father to suicide when he was a kid, and he's a very well-known suicide researcher out of Florida State. A lot of his later research was funded by the DoD. But what he points out is he gets away from symptoms, and he talks about these three constructs here. They are perceived burdensomeness and low belongingness. Long words to say. But the idea is that when someone combines feeling like they're a burden to others with a sense of social disconnection, that's when someone is at highest risk. And that is kind of more on the psychological side, or what we might call the cognitive side. That's where the thinking starts going into a direction of being suicidal. That is problematic and dangerous, but may not lead to behavior unless someone is able to get into a state of acting on those thoughts. And in this theory, he posits that capacity or capability for suicide is a key factor that is maybe underappreciated. And in his work in military veterans, he points out that harming yourself goes against our nature. We all are predisposed for self-preservation. And unfortunately, as people move closer to suicide, they often are practicing things that can make them more likely to act on these thoughts. And so that's where making smaller suicidal gestures, someone might say, oh, they're just acting out, that's not really a serious attempt. Well, unfortunately, that can be something they practice that gets them closer to high risk. He also points out in military populations, if you're in a setting where you're asked to do things that are also societally, not necessarily second nature, that too can be part of that practicing and can drive risk. And so, anyway, his theory is when these three come together, that's when people are at risk. There are some pros and cons of this theory that aren't worth getting into, but what I like about it is it really, in reading it, it helped me shift from thinking diagnostically to a little more dynamically about what's going on. Here's a more modern theory. There's too many boxes here to go through, but the point is that it still describes this pathway from risk. And I think that is as you're thinking about who's at risk and how can you help them, trying to think of them a little bit on a trajectory and where are the risk factors starting to sum up. Did someone get home? Are they now experiencing employment problems? There's problems with their significant other, those sorts of things. Are they starting to talk about maybe not being interested in the future? Where are things piling up? And then from the standpoint of interventions, where along that path can you intervene? And that's where I think as a system, we have to be looking for those touch points where people are at high risk and getting higher and higher risk. And that's where we have to then ratchet up our response so that we can be more helpful. Okay, so that is my risk factor part of the talk. You guys have any questions? Yes?
I've got a couple for you. In the military, we were always, at least in the Air Force, it was always focused on ACE, an intervention strategy. And it was always frustrating to me because, we're to the point where somebody is actually expressing an ideation of suicide.
Yep.
And then it's you're a goalkeeper at that point. And then what you were pointing at is more proactive things leading up to that. But I guess to me it was, how have we been able to equip people to make these interventions earlier in that process? Are there things that we can teach, rules of thumb and all, to people other than when people have expressed a direct ideation towards suicide?
Yeah, I think that it's an excellent question. I'd say the jury is still out. So the hope would be that you could teach some of those skills to lower risk. So I have a colleague here in Ann Arbor who did a peer-based loneliness intervention. And the idea is when people are feeling like they don't belong, that sense of connection is dropping off. And you and I were talking earlier, you know, this can be hard as people transition out of the military, or if they're in the Guard and then they're back in an area where they're at a distance from other people that have been through what they've been through. Can you build that social connection and then through that kind of help decrease risk? And you know, there are those types of broader scale interventions, and then as people become higher risk, what you'd hope you do is get more and more focused on helping them with suicide-specific thoughts and actions. But that's almost, I'd say that's mostly theoretical now. There isn't really a system that does that all that effectively.
Okay, and I guess the other is just an observation with a question on the end of it related to that is everything you talked about would require you to interact with somebody,
Yep.
to be able to get those cues.
Yep.
So how much of what we do today on social media and everything is affecting the fact that we don't interact with human beings?
Yep.
Is that an increased risk factor in its own right?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think we don't. I mean, across the board, from kind of a psychology perspective, the companies that are selling us these devices and apps know how they work probably better than the scientific community.
Sure.
So the impact of how people feel when they're using a device and what they do over time, I think we are not there. This isn't totally what you're asking, but it reminds me of it. There are a few suicide researchers that use smartphones to monitor, and they'll check in with people and day to day, how are you doing? Do you have any thoughts about suicide today? And they've tried to make that positive. There's one guy who tracks your steps, and you know, if you're normally active and then you kind of go off a cliff, that might not be a good thing. Not literally off a cliff, but if you're walking, it goes down to like 10 steps, then that's a sign you might not be doing as well. But that's very much its infancy.
Okay, well, just as an aside, you know, we actually had an app at one point for our suicide prevention back in DC, and one of the things we had was, we called it the Wingman Wednesdays, which was an automated way to remind you every Wednesday to check in with somebody just to see how they're
That's
doing.
awesome.
But that was built into the app because somebody asked it. Which leads to the last part of my mind, I'll shut up. Breaking this down by age, is there a difference in the risk factors depending on whether they're millennials or Gen X? Because I think that natural resiliency between those demographics is dramatically different. We could use all sorts of derogatory terms of snowflakes or whatever, but the bottom line is I think how people deal with problems today is way different than they were dealt with in the past. And did the data that you pull show a difference between those age groups, not just when they separated and all, but based on
Age, yeah, no, it's a great question. I actually had an age slide in here, which I took out, so I wish I could point to it. But the highest risk group is that youngest group in veterans, whereas in the US population, older men are the highest risk group. In the VA, the 18, I think, to 40-year-olds were the highest risk group, and have increased a little bit as well. So they've always been since at least 2001, and then they've increased a little bit. It's interesting because who makes up that group has shifted in terms of that, you know, now it's the millennials or whatever. You know, I don't know how much of that is unique to those factors. And again, I think we're in our infancy in understanding that stuff.
Just a comment just to throw out. So my son has issues, and our oldest that was both in, I told you, Iraq and Afghanistan, and the being the internet piece was a double-edged sword, right? So it helped him reconnect with his people, but it also gave him, unfortunately, an awful lot of they would talk about who committed suicide, and that would kind of get him in this iteration of why I bother, I'm going to end up being, you know, one of those guys, and you know, but then again, he also connected with guys, and so it was this thing that was, it gave and it took at the same time kind of thing, and we have noticed that when he stays away from it, he's better, than when he's down in that machine doing that. Although it has, like I said, it has connected him with some folks that he can physically now visit. So he just went and had to take a part to Texas and drive, and he just got a hold of all the Texas people, and they all came out and visited him when he was on his little trip. So it helps and it hurts at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I'd say in some ways suicide support is like that, even taking the internet piece out of it, feeling, sharing stories and connecting about someone we've lost can help, but it also, reminds you of how many people we've lost along the way.
Right.
So it's, yeah.
Oh, you had talked about trial runs at suicide,
Yeah.
Is it something as overt as cutting, or can you give some examples of what are behaviors somebody may exhibit that in their mind are trial runs?
So in Joyner's model, what he would say is his pretty inclusive definition, and he'd say that the more that someone models that behavior, the greater risk they are. So you could probably create a continuum from, thinking about a suicide attempt method, but not taking any action, to maybe trying out a little bit, to maybe holding, if you're thinking firearm, holding a firearm, thinking about suicide, that would put you at greater risk than if you had just thought about it and not held it, and so on and so forth. So the more that someone approximates, and to me, what rings true about this is people describe that process of getting close, and there is this habituation, something that seemed just they would never consider doing whatever. They do something a little bit, and then that doesn't really freak them out too much. Then they do the next thing a little bit, and all of a sudden I'm trying to be kind of vague and describe. They could be in a position where they're, have easy access to a very lethal means, and they've become comfortable with it. And if you combine that with a time that someone feels really lousy, that's when the risk gets really high. Yeah.
Is there a difference between a Vietnam era veteran and today's veterans psychologically? I started a suicide prevention phone system back in the 60s. And after the first month or so, we decided we need to start asking the question, are you a veteran? And the dynamics of that phone call started changing very quickly. But there seems to me to be a difference between the veterans then and the veterans now.
Yeah.
Is there psychologically?
I'll just speak more anecdotally from my experience is yes, when you're talking to, when I started working in the VA, we had a lot of World War II veterans, and then Vietnam, Korean War, and then Vietnam, and so the culture changes a bit, but some of these factors, I think, do feel like they still ring true. I mean, the experience of a Vietnam veteran coming back from conflict was very different than people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so if we think that feeling like you belong or feeling like others value you is a risk factor, that probably looked pretty different between those two groups. But day to day, some of the feelings of isolation, frustration probably sound really similar. So I guess maybe yes, there's similarities and differences. Is there one thing in particular do you feel like was core to that experience?
Vietnam veterans seem to be more communicative personally than today's veterans. Today's veterans, social media is all over it. Back then, of course, you didn't have much social media. If they had any at all, it was a miracle. But today, or at that time, we would get them together in groups and sit down and talk, and it dealt more with the prevention than it did with, and today that just doesn't happen. I don't see it happening anyway.
Yeah.
It's wonderful that the VA finally got involved in it.
Yeah.
Because that's the key to it.
No. I agree. Maybe I'll keep going ahead with just intervention work, and then we can circle back. So just as the field has evolved to think about suicide as a different outcome than just a disorder, it's also evolved to think about interventions for suicide needing to look different than just treating the disorder. So again, thinking back to my training where it was about a condition making someone suicidal, that's the way people talk about it, their depression is making them suicidal, then the solution to that was to treat the depression. And the hope was if you address the underlying psychiatric condition, the suicide risk would go away. And I think we know now that that's may be necessary for some patients to address the psychiatric condition, but it's often not sufficient to reduce suicide risk. So there are a handful of suicide-specific interventions. One of them is called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Suicide Prevention, or CBT-SP. And I'm probably just going to skim over the specifics. I can always go back to that. But the point that I want to make with this is it's actually fairly effective. Sometimes when you talk to people about suicide prevention, they can be really hopeless. They can feel like, yeah, there's nothing we can really do. It doesn't make a difference. And there are a handful of studies now showing this approach, which is a psychotherapy approach that hones in for 12 to 14 sessions on suicide, maybe similar to kind of the groups you were talking about there. And they show benefits over time. These are two different studies. Greg Brown's study, and these were adults from emergency rooms in Philadelphia, and then David Rudd and Craig Bryan's study was active duty military recruited from a base in Colorado. And the survival curves spread out here, so that it'll kind of just in general, if you don't make an attempt, you stay up at 1, and every time someone makes an attempt, the figure drops down there. And you see the spread there shows that there is this protective effect of cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention. So in Ann Arbor here, we worked with some of those teams and wanted to test out this approach in the VA, and we used 2 sites, the Ann Arbor VA and Denver VA, and we honed in on, again, I mentioned my interest in substance use disorders. We thought maybe the individuals in drug and alcohol treatment could be particularly high risk and benefit from an intervention. And it's my belief that there's something that is just so incredibly frustrating about when someone relapses, which is just part of having a substance use disorder. People have setbacks that can really make people feel uniquely like they're a burden to others and put them at high risk. So we took the CBT-SP approach, we made it specific to substance use. I'll kind of skim through it, but the content was meant to be relevant to people in drug and alcohol treatment, and we randomized them to that or a control condition. And unfortunately, the results of this study were not as encouraging as I would have liked. This was a 6-year DoD study. It was the biggest study I've ever done, and maybe will ever do. And unfortunately, the results did not show benefit. The one thing I'll point out is that only 14% of people who were in the study made a suicide attempt over our 2-year follow-up period. And this 14% number was much lower than what was in those prior studies. So when I showed you those lines separating, part of the separation was that the control condition had a lot of attempts. For us, we had very few attempts in our control condition. So maybe we didn't have a high enough risk group. This also was in the VA, and people were really plugged into a lot of different suicide prevention initiatives, even if they were in the control condition. But we didn't see a lot of benefit of the intervention. That said, patients reported really liking it. Clinically, it seemed like a powerful intervention. I think the kind of jury's still out on the value there. As that study was winding up, we had 4 therapists we had hired with the DoD's support, and we went to the VA and said, these people are gonna, lose their jobs when this study ends. You guys know how federal contracts work. It's about to end. We think that these are 4 of probably 10 to 12 people around the country that are actually able to do this intervention. We know from the prior literature that it works in certain populations. What can we do to not just lose them and let them go take a different job. And the VA, and I think to their credit, took a chance on it, investing in it, and they developed this study that it wasn't a study, it was more like kind of a clinical pilot that was based in Ann Arbor and Denver, where we created telehealth hubs. And we had the different VAs around in those regions refer into Ann Arbor, and then they could get 12 sessions with one of these therapists specifically focusing on suicide prevention. And this isn't research, we don't have outcome data, but it was generally really a positive experience. We got a lot of referrals in. It was before COVID, so we thought we were very novel doing this over telehealth, and then everything went to telehealth, so it wasn't very novel anymore, but
You were there first.
we can claim, that we were doing that, and I think that we were able to manage risk, which was the main, there was a lot of pushback, we couldn't manage risk. So anyway, it worked well, and the VA did a nationwide rollout of it in something they call SP 2.0, and there was just a presentation last week that I think over 17,000 veterans around the country have received SP 2.0 suicide prevention interventions, and based around the manual and the training stuff we developed around those 4 therapists, it's kind of spread around the country. So that's been a really nice and gratifying experience, and I think the VA deserves a lot of credit of trying to move things forward as best they can. Okay, so I've got one more intervention study to go through. Let me just do that quickly, and I'll do another pause for questions. This one's focused around the Veterans Crisis Line, and the VA, the VCL is a national resource to support veterans in crisis. It launched in 2007, again around that time the VA was under a lot of scrutiny and didn't know what to do. They tried to standardize crisis lines, and it's been a huge success in terms of reach, so that you could see that they've received, over 1.3 million referrals. They've got over close to 7 million calls, so they're getting a lot of calls. The nice thing about the VA is when someone calls in, if they're willing to share their identifying information, they can get linked up to care. So then there are people that follow up with that person. Instead of it just being support, it can turn into a warm handoff. And the VCL is now part of something that's the 988. I don't know if you guys know 988, but it's kind of like a crisis support line like 911, but for mental health. And that also has been really successful. It has grown. These are the numbers off their website from January of this year. They got over 500,000 contacts. So people are using these lines, and but there's also a lot we don't know. The part that we focused on was that it's hard to study this, but in surveys of people where they ask, have you ever used a crisis line? They categorize people as high or low risk. They found that only 5% of those with serious distress or could have benefited from 988 actually used the crisis line. So there's still, I think, a disconnect, despite this popularity of this resource, between people who could use it and the ones using it. So we developed a single session intervention that we call crisis line facilitation, where we meet with the veteran, we talk a little bit about their prior suicide attempt, we tell them about the crisis line, ask them what it'd be like to use it, and then we actually do a practice call sitting there with them. And for this, sometimes people say, well, why do you practice calling the phone? Like everyone knows how to call the phone. And the point is that when people are in a high-risk, high-pressure situation, they perform better if they practice what they are doing first. So the military knows this well. It's kind of a big part of how people spend their time. And that's true for very simple tasks, very complex tasks. So we did a study of this. We recruited in Battle Creek and here in Ann Arbor, and 300 veterans coming off an inpatient psych unit. We randomized them either to get the crisis line facilitation or another intervention. And we did see benefit. So over a course of a year after this one about 45-minute intervention, those who received crisis line facilitation were less likely to make a suicide attempt than those who did not. So we thought this was a good sign, and again, the VA is working with us to now expand access to that understanding of care. There are, the results, it wasn't, I wouldn't call it a home run, it was like a triple or something. There were some other aspects where we didn't see effects, but the primary outcome on attempt, which is what we cared about most, is where we saw. We're doing some other research on that. One's focused on individuals in drug and alcohol treatment. The other one's funded by the CDC, and it's based in the National Guard here in Michigan. We're recruiting, actually we wrapped up recruitment, and we recruit from units during their training weekends. We randomize them to this crisis line facilitation or not. And so far, the descriptive information is that people have been positive about that experience. So we wondered whether Guard units would feel like this was a good use of their time, but overall, it wasn't that everyone loved it. They tended to report feeling more confident they could call the crisis line, they could use it. We framed it in terms of supporting a buddy as well as yourself, and they seem to appreciate that intervention. So we're going to be looking at whether that changes outcomes over time. And then the last piece here is just a kind of a pitch for, we're part of this thing called the Sprint Network, which I'm one of 5 leads from around the country in the VA's efforts to improve the quality and impact of suicide prevention research. So we're kind of trying to support other VAs to do more impactful suicide research. And you can see these are the priorities of Sprint, which reflect priorities, broader priorities of VAs in terms of suicide prevention. And this includes things like lethal means safety, making the trainings they do count, trying to pull in others, broader community, focusing on interpersonal violence, and then developing precision medicine approaches. The idea that it's not one size fits all, but maybe there's interventions that are best for certain subgroups. Okay, so this is my summary. I think I'll just kind of wrap up and then see if you guys have questions. Yes?
I have a question. I belong to VFW in Sterling Heights, and we have a comrade that has talked about suicide many times. He has a house full of weapons. His house is in foreclosure. And right now, the VA has a moratorium on foreclosures until June. So we're trying to get this guy, 56 years old, never been married, abused a lot of alcohol over the years. Would you recommend that we do the Wingman Wednesday more often and talk to him, visit with him, etc.?
Yeah.
He gets down in the dumps and he starts talking about the 22 number that he's gonna do himself in. And we can't get him down to the VA. He stood me up at least once when I tried to get him in my car and take him down there. Not feeling good, can't do it.
Yeah.
So you think that repetition, more contact from fellow members in our post would be helpful?
Yes, I mean, I do think that general sense of support really does help. Other things that you might not be open to could include, you could offer to, he could call the crisis line. Sometimes they can do some case management, and there are resources that they can link people to, and sometimes, if it works better if people are not connected, so that that initial call can get them linked up with programs, but he could at least have a call with them and learn what their options are. Sometimes people are resistant to call because they say, well, they're going to lock me up, but that is a very small number of all calls that go in end up in that outcome, and people can choose to be anonymous if they want to when they call, and he could just talk to someone there. And the final piece, which again he may not be open to, was, would he be willing to work with a local shooting club or with a colleague to have them hold on to his weapons for a period of time until he was feeling better. Some people are open to that, some aren't, but just talking explicitly about where are those guns stored, and would he trust someone to hold on to those until he's feeling more like he's on his feet.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, but it's hard. I mean, I'm not,
It's
none of these things.
It's a challenge.
Wow, just what a wonderful presentation on a very tough topic. But as we kind of, I know people probably want to talk to you, some sidebar type of things, but as we finish up, one of the things when you and I were talking beforehand was, you said you feel like you're always talking to the same group of people about the program, about the studies and that type of stuff. So let me make a statement. We are the AFA. We have a network. We have connections at the national level. What can we do to affect this equation? What types of things can this organization do to be an advocate to make the work that you're doing more effective?
Well, I really appreciate that. I think, sometimes if you do this work, you feel like you're in an echo chamber. So, and truly, like, you go around the country and you see the same people in the room with you, and you wonder, are we really moving the needle here? I think you could tell me whether this would be valuable, but in my mind, I think it would be helpful for the community to know that the VA is making a lot of efforts. I don't think those always end up being as impactful as they could be, but they're actually very motivated to try different things. So if people have creative solutions, if they have groups that they run that have been beneficial, the VA wants to hear about that, and I think then, you know, that would be useful. I think trying to have a better dialogue about suicide prevention as a approachable and valuable tool. I think people still view suicide prevention as something that's going to come in and do things to people against their will in ways that are not what they would choose. And, you know, I think if there are ways to talk about, you know, are there groups that are more knowledgeable about firearms than your typical VA provider? Can they help with the wording? They still are invested in keeping their members safe. Can they help shape that dialogue about safety? Can patients talk more about what would help them feel comfortable reaching out?
Okay, and I would love to explore that, because one of my thoughts, and the veterans in the room can reinforce this, like any military program, it became a square filler. You know, every year we had to do our ACE training.
Yep.
Yeah, we've heard the same damn thing over and over again. What's going to be different this time? And we get pretty cynical about it,
Yep.
which means we're not receptive to maybe there's a different way to approach it that might be more constructive. So how to overcome that barrier to effective communication and possibly effectiveness of all this is something that we certainly can talk and explore going forward.
Yeah.
Any other questions as we're, go ahead.
Yeah, so mine comes from a very personal level, but also as a post 9/11 veteran who's lost a lot of guys in my unit have killed themselves.
Yeah.
You know, the Lansing CBOC 18 months ago, I called them and said, you know, I'm having suicidal thoughts. I need to come talk to somebody. And they said, okay, it'll be 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And I was like, cool, I won't be alive in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, so I understand when, you know, the VA is doing stuff, but what they're not doing, and I don't know why, would be hiring literally more physical doctors for us to speak with, because I think that's, you know, the hardest part is if you get us to actually call,
Yep.
you better catch us.
No, I totally agree.
You know, that's boy, I think where the VA always falls short in my mind is the mental health aspect, the psychologists that can sit and talk with us. There are just too many of us and so few of them. And I think it's probably a mixture of burnout and they can make more money in the private sector, but.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that a lot where people say, when I go to the VA, I'm looking for individual help and they want to send me to a group.
Mhm.
It's kind of like, you know, can I get one-on-one contact? Can I get support in that way? And it is partially a workforce issue. There's more need than support. I think the other thing is, are there other resources the VA could lean on to support people and get you in quicker? So
Yeah.
there are these
And that's-
suicide prevention coordinators, like why didn't they hook you up with one of them?
Yeah.
Who could be reaching out? I don't have a good
I
answer.
used to have a therapist through, it was through Kalamazoo Psychology, it was like outsourced through the vet center.
Yep.
But they canceled the contract, so then all of the vets from that vet had to go to the VA and then fight for one of those doctors.
Yep.
And it's just like, it's not actually helping us, you know? At the VFW National Home, we had, what was her name? The
Which one?
lady who came a couple weeks ago.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. I know where.
Dana Nessel.
There you go.
I can't think of her job title right now.
There she is.
And we can talk all day about the politics of it, but one thing she was talking about was the red flag laws for veterans and how family members can now call if you think someone's gonna commit suicide, you know, they'll come and take your weapons, but all you have to do is prove that you've gone to therapy for an amount of time and then you do get them back.
Yep.
And like, I know that, again, you could argue the politics all day long, but like, that's pretty damn effective, you know, when it comes to like what, you know, my wife doesn't know what to do when I'm having a hard time.
Yeah.
So I'm lucky that I have veteran friends that will come take my firing pins from me.
Yep.
But it's definitely an uphill battle, because as time goes on, I think that we get more and more just tired
Yeah.
of the mental fight.
Well, and I think that those average improvements, because I do think, I mean, I've seen in the VA average improvements year over year in certain things, but within that average, there's all sorts of experiences,
Mhm.
and some of those can be bad. And all it takes is one or two where people just say, screw it, I'm done
Mhm.
trying to make it work. The one thing I've become, and I was a skeptic, but I've actually been convinced at the value of the Veterans Crisis Line. And
Mhm.
a lot of the people who take calls either are veterans themselves or family members. There are terrific people there. There's, again, a range, but
Yeah.
there are some terrific people there. And they are a resource. I've seen veterans who've reached out there and been able to make a faster, they've been able to connect up faster to care
Okay.
through that resource than just calling their local
Good
VA.
to know.
It shouldn't work that way,
That's
but
really
it's,
nice to know,
yeah.
because like,
Yeah.
so my son thinks the VA is the enemy.
Yep,
Yeah.
no, I know that.
Yeah.
So I want to piggyback on that real quick, though. You made a good point about the number of psychologists that are available, and you're an educator now. At my last base, we had 7 billets for psychologists, psychiatrists, and we had 2 out of 7. So the volume, to your point, was just astronomical. You couldn't get in to see them. But as an educator now, what are you seeing as far as like output? Are we creating enough? Are we building up enough of these psychiatrists, psychologists to be out there and be available? It seems like there's not enough. Like, how do we get more produced?
It's a great question. I mean, there's a shortage of especially psychiatrists, so prescribers are the most scarce. And then psychologists may be less scarce, and then social workers are more common. But there's a shortage overall. I mean, I see this at UofM too, the wait list to get into the mental health clinic there is about, well, it can be a while on camera. So it's a problem. It's a realistic problem. And I don't know if we can make it work better, but I think that on the VA side, there have been hiring initiatives, but just getting people in and retaining is challenging.
I have one last thing. You never touched back on the pain aspect
Yeah.
of the suicide.
Yeah. So pain's really complicated. We've looked at that a couple different ways. I mean, it's definitely a risk factor. There now is the added complication of the opioid epidemic, and then what happens with prescribing. You know, the opioid thing has to be handled well, and especially as we were getting in the teens, I want to say like 2012, it went from really liberal prescribing to like you couldn't get them, and that shift was incredibly hard on people, and they were left just holding the bag.
I went from methadone to morphine to Oxycontin and then cut off.
Yeah,
And it was brutal.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, it's. I think there's awareness in the rearview mirror that wasn't right.
Yeah.
But in the moment, it was tough on a lot of people, psychologists. Yeah.
Brennan, I know that he got out after I did, and so I don't know what the culture is like necessarily today, but like when I got out in 2006, talking about, you know, just the taboo of mental health and needing mental health services, it was so hard in the Army to go and be like, I'm having a hard time with what we just saw.
Yeah.
You know, I need to go talk to someone. You're just gonna get shit for that. So then you just put that in the box, and that box doesn't open until after you're out.
It
And
didn't improve.
see, it's the same. So it's the same.
Short
I
answer,
think
I didn't
that's
improve.
true. I think that's true.
Wow. All right, well, just to be stewards of everyone's time,
Yeah.
I'm sure he's more than happy to sit here and talk if you have any further, questions and everything else, but. Our normal gift that we normally give to a speaker, one, I apologize for I forgot to bring, but the other is it's just really odd to give a really big damn bullet to somebody talking about suicide prevention.
Hardball, don't you have a hardball outside?
Helmet?
No.
I know, that's what you got.
Maybe a pilot helmet or something like that, but we owe you a big bullet. So that'd be a good conversation piece in your office. But what I do, and I don't mean this to sound narcissistic, but when I wrote my book that just came out recently, from the very beginning, stories of people throughout my life that I've known that have committed suicide, and how I ended up getting involved with suicide prevention at the national level. So my gift
Oh,
also
sweet.
on that.
That's a good gift.